Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Podcast Daily. Happy Monday. Hope you are off to a great start to your week. We're going to really spice it up with a conversation that I'm sure you won't enjoy maybe nearly as much, but we're going to try our best.
What a way to intro it. You're not going to like this.
I think it's truth in advertising. This could be a subject that might bring up some painful memories for Ohio State fans. I don't know. But I think one of the most interesting and illuminating things I've read recently was Bill going back through at ohiostate.rivals.com and re-ranking Ohio State's 2019 signing class. And it was quite an exercise for Bill. So Bill Landis over there, we'll dive into that. I think it would be helpful to have some of Berm's perspective over on the other side to take us through why this may have happened or how it may have happened and evaluate that success. And then maybe I will add in a couple supplements because Ohio State did do pretty well in the transfer portal that year, but that doesn't count for this purpose. So, Bill, what did you learn going through this?
It was like expected, I guess. Like if you think back, like that was the bridge class sort of between Urban Meyer and Ryan Day, and they had a few decommitments, some related to the coaching change. I think maybe one or two of them weren't. They were just kind of random and happened to occur at the same time or around the same time. It was a really small class, so it was ranked low. And then I think if you were to, I guess, like separate it from Ohio State's other successes in recruiting, like compared to other classes and where it ranked, and just sort of said like this was a class that ranked like in the 20s nationally, and then assess what it did in the 4 years after that, it actually probably wasn't that bad, but by Ohio State standards, it did come up a little bit lacking. So it wasn't surprising. It was more like refreshing my memory. Like, okay, we had some questions about this class when it came in. We all know what's transpired over the last 4 years, but we can kind of assess it top to bottom after the fact. You're like, you know what? It's not great, but it kind of makes sense based on what we knew at the time when they came in.
Yeah, what we knew was that you were losing a legendary head coach who had won national championships in two different schools, on the brink or on the cusp or on the press, whatever it was. I don't know. It was as a result of what felt like a pretty weird scandal at the time. And you were replacing him with a head coach who'd never been a head coach before and was 39 years old. So it was something that I think you expected. As you mentioned, like it was only 17 kids in the class. Mm-hmm. And when you look at that number by itself, I mean, that in it is crazy. That's an extremely low number. But honestly, the work Ryan Day had to do in the last couple weeks leading up to that, and at that point when Ryan Day took over, Zach Harrison was not in the class yet. So like he was, the biggest, highest ranked piece. And so Ryan Day actually won that battle, in his first 2 weeks as a head coach. But the work he had to do in keeping Harry Miller in the class, keeping Garrett Wilson in the class, like those are things that were very important at the time. But as you look back, it's like, wow, that there was some depth pieces that just did not happen. But one thing I thought was interesting was the names you brought up who were the decommitments from that class. The big one was Jordan Battle, who ended up flipping and signing with Alabama on signing day. But he, now is an NFL draft pick for the Bengals last week. So, but other than that, you have Samson James, Kane Patterson. This was not a group of guys. It's funny how often decommitments that feel really painful at the time they happen end up being nothing. Yeah. Doug Mester, Samson James, DeJuan Mathis, and Kane Patterson, along with Jordan Battle.
Yeah, not sure that Ohio State really missed out on a ton there other than Jordan Battle, perhaps. It seemed like, Berm, correct me if I'm wrong, that Garrett Wilson, who Bill had as number one and most valuable in terms of his impact with the Buckeyes, was also maybe the most important in keeping this class as it was together. I believe he might have been one of the first to publicly affirm Ryan Day's the head coach and I'm not going anywhere.
He said, if Ryan Day's the head coach, I'm not going anywhere. And that was all you needed to hear. So it was also, right at the time when Brian Hartline was taking over as the Ohio State wide receivers coach. And so that duo, Hartline was involved in his recruitment, but it was primarily Zach Smith and Ryan Day who was involved, but Ryan Day had a much bigger hand in that. It's actually when Ryan Day was the offensive coordinator, he was the guy who had a big hand in the Harry Miller recruitment, who was a 5-star in this class, huge hand in the Zach Harrison recruitment when it came to it, and a big hand in Garrett Wilson. So it was the first time we really got to see Ryan Day being used as more than just a quarterback recruiter. And then quickly, obviously, it pivoted to him now being the head coach and having to deal with all the other stuff. So it was interesting to see Ryan Day's impact as a full-on offensive coordinator and using his ability to connect with people in the recruiting trail, because that was the first time Urban Meyer really, relied on him to do that.
There is some, remaining pieces here. The grade is not fully complete, Bill, because the 2019 class still has several guys that are on the roster. I don't know that it's a Tommy Eichenberg and Steele Chambers and Cade Stover can totally flip the perception of this group, but at least the opportunity exists for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think they can in a fairly significant way. Certainly, if they were to help lead a team that beats Michigan this year or wins another Big Ten title, this group does technically have two Big Ten rings. I don't know how really instrumental they were in those wins, because it was one. Yeah, 19 and 20. Yeah, 19. Yeah. I forget what happened in 2020. It's a blur of a year. But they have two big.
They didn't beat Michigan that year. They would have beat them by 1 million.
Right. Right. So they're 1-2 against Michigan, but they have two Big Ten titles, 3 playoff berths, a national championship game berth. Like, there's stuff there to like with this group, but I think you can also fairly question, like, okay, they have all that, but how instrumental was this group in the highlights or the high points of that resume? And the fair answer is probably not as much as they should have been, but there's an opportunity for them to be this year. So if they beat Michigan, if they win the Big Ten, if they get back to the playoff, if they get to the national championship, like all the guys you mentioned, Tommy Eichenberg, Steele Chambers, Cade Stover, like they're going to have to play important parts of that. And that can, I think, somewhat dramatically change the perception of this class. And it's kind of funny too. Like Tommy is an interesting guy in this class, because if you look at it top to bottom, you probably come away feeling a little disappointed, but it also has some really, I think, noteworthy success stories of like guys that Ohio State sort of, I don't know if unearthed is the right word, but guys that outperformed their ranking. And Tommy is certainly one of them. Like, he was going to go to Boston College up until the 11th hour when Ohio State got him. DeJuan Jones, obviously, is probably one of the better ones that Ohio State has had in my time covering the team. They go from ranked in the thousands to being an All-American and a guy who was taken maybe a little lower in the draft, but he was a good player. So if Tommy stays on that trajectory, if Steele keeps getting better, if Cade puts together a healthier season than he had last year, then yeah, you're right. The story is not written. It's mostly written, but it's not finished, and I think it can be somewhat significantly better than it has been to this point.
Given the timing of it, was it challenging for you at all to figure out? Like, DeJuan is unequivocally a success story, from 3-star project to making an impact almost right away. I think you had him at 25 or 26 starts for Ohio State, earned some All-American nods, and then he's a draft pick. Like, how did you factor in stuff with like him or Ronnie Hickman sort of sliding down in the NFL draft? Because that was probably pretty fresh in your mind.
It definitely impacted Ronnie more. As I was going through it and like writing kind of the blurbs and everything, like the way I did it was I just sort of like ranked them just kind of without just like what was in my head, without looking stuff up, without like writing out the blurbs. And then as I went through and then added like statistics to that and then wrote out like my thoughts more fully on each guy, I did move them around some. And Ronnie was a guy that fell down probably 2 or 3 spots as I was doing that. DeJuan was like pretty instantly number 2 for me. I think in the back of my mind, I thought that he could eventually be leaped by Tommy, or perhaps even Steele. I think that he's pretty close to what the floor is already, I think, in this class, DeJuan, because of how good of a player he became. But it was in my mind, like, I don't know if DeJuan somehow ended up being a first-round pick, I still don't think I would have considered him for number 1 because Garrett was so good. It was just like such the obvious number 1, but he would have been really difficult to knock out at number 2 spot no matter what happened with the guys behind him. I think there's opportunity for Tommy especially to leapfrog him. But it definitely impacted my view of Ronnie. The draft stuff combined with how last season ended probably has Ronnie, I don't know, 3 spots lower than he could have been otherwise in this class.
Yeah, I mean, you have him right before Jamison Williams, who transferred 3 years ago. So it is a little bit weird when you think about, I mean, 17 kids, 6 of them transferred. You have the Harry Miller medical retirement. You have Marcus Crowley's medical retirement. Like, the fact that there are even the number of success stories that you're talking about is somewhat a surprise, because the rest of the class feels so incomplete and overall bad.
I think it's also a pretty remarkable tribute to the program and the other classes around it, and to some extent the way Ohio State supplemented it with the transfer portal, because when you're looking at the year-over-year success of programs that are competing for a national championship, you can't really have blips like this and still compete. There's a lot of evidence that suggests, and this came up a lot with Clemson, where they were sort of the exception to the rule, where it's like you need to have 4 top 5 classes in a row to build the kind of roster that can win a national championship, or if not top 5, maybe top 10. I'd have to refer to some of that research again, but like the fact that Ohio State was able to sustain this level of success during the transition. Now, they haven't won a national championship, and then they've lost the last couple of games to Michigan. So I don't know how much blame or credit to assign specifically to 2019. That's sort of the challenge of this exercise. But it is pretty remarkable that you look at this list of 17 people with not a lot of ability to miss, not a lot of built-in margin for error, and that Ohio State did stay as a top 5 program throughout all this.
I think if I hesitate to call what's happened over the last couple of years like a dip, because that sounds too dramatic, but it is some step lower than I think people would like, where people would like Ohio State to be. And the fact that it didn't get worse when you think about this class, and like the 2018 class, which was star-studded, and much higher ranked than this one, like did not pan out. I think you might be able to make an argument that class was worse than this one based on where they were ranked when they came into it. And I've done this exercise before at the Athletic. I think I've done this since 2016 since 2016 class or something like that, which was actually ended up being a very good class. And 2017 was good, but like 18 and 19 did not work out very well. And I think you're right. There is something to the idea of like they had back-to-back probably what they would consider overall misses in terms of totality of classes in 18 and 19, and they didn't fall off a cliff. They might have taken a slight step back and are trying to regain that footing a little bit, but I think it could have been worse than it has been. So like much worse.
I mean, it's even bigger than that when you add in the 2020 class, which obviously had a handful of stars, the CJ Strouds, Jackson Smith, and Jigbas, et cetera. But that group has not panned out. And I think if you look at defensively, that's where the issues come. You look at this stretch from 2018 to 2020 on the defensive side of the ball specifically, there has not been a number of the guys that you thought were going to be the stars that have emerged as the stars. I mean, you have to go back to the 2017 class with Chase Young and Jeff Okuda and Baron Browning and Sean Wade. All those guys, that class was phenomenal, but it really was a something skipped in that middle there. And then, which now we're talking about the potentially historic draft class next year, but almost all of those guys are in the 2021 class. So not in the 2019 or 2020. So obviously we're expecting Tommy Eichenberger, Steel Chambers to get drafted, but the names that we see at the top of those lists are all in the 2021 class.
Yeah, I wrote about it kind of dovetailed unintentionally, but I wrote earlier in the week about what Ohio State's doing with transfers this spring, especially in the defensive side of the ball. And I do think it is a direct result of the 18, 19, and 20 recruiting classes to this point, all of whom are draft eligible. To this point, those 3 classes have produced 3 NFL draft picks on the defensive side of the ball. And I think the previous 3 years, if I have this right, produced 16 draft picks on the defensive side of the ball. Like I think it's a combination of the head coaching change, maybe on some level like college football changing a little bit and offenses being even more potent than they were, not that long ago. But also I don't know, off the top of my head, I think they've had like 14 defensive assistant coaches in that time period too. There's been no stability on that side of the ball to like build a class and sustain it and build on top of it.
Yeah. So obviously the other part that is not quantified in a recruiting class is landing Justin Fields in the transfer portal. And the Dwan Mathis for Justin
Fields trade was pretty good for Ohio State in the end of things. And when you look back on it, last week, Bill, I mentioned that I thought Ohio State was maybe getting a little bit more cutthroat, right? Mm-hmm. And in the transfer game, we're still talking about, the potential visit or coming up this week for Jalen Key, the UAB safety transfer. Like, how this all started, I think, with Ryan Day in 2019 with Justin Fields saying, hey, this room is not good enough, and I'm going to go out and get a quarterback that fits what I want. And to go out and pick a former 5-star, 1 year removed from high school, who he had no real recruiting relationship with at all prior to, Justin's decision to transfer to Ohio State was incredibly, like, smart by Ryan Day, obviously, but also really showed that he was willing to make these tough decisions right out of the gate as a head coach. And I think there's some mindset or some belief amongst the fan base that Ryan Day is too nice. But like, he was the guy that immediately said, this quarterback room isn't good enough, I'm going to go find someone else. And that is telling, I think, because we have seen that continue throughout the last couple of years with him. When he realizes that there's a big issue, he does not hesitate to address it whatever way he feels he has to.
Austin, you want to finish your thought?
Yeah, I was going to say it was one of the all-time heists in college football is Dwan Mathis and future considerations for Justin Fields. And I was also going to say, aside from that part, which is obvious, Justin Fields is one of the best quarterbacks in Ohio State history. Jonah Jackson was a really important part of this as well. Didn't arrive until the summer. So again, the portal is different. Maybe that means it's going to be more challenging for you in the future to go through re-ranking of classes. Maybe as the portal becomes more active, you have to include that in some capacity. I don't know. This is your project and your exercise. So I won't tell you how to do it because I enjoy it the way it is. But like, it's almost like become this off-season roster management, and you can't evaluate it on the middle of December, the early signing period, or the first Wednesday in February. It gets almost a 5-month period, sort of like, the NFL offseason at this point.
I think at some point it'll have to change. Like you said, like the line has become blurred between high school recruiting and adding guys from the portal. I mean, back then it was still, you had to get the waiver. Like we had to wait for Justin Fields to see if he could play immediately. I think Jonah Jackson might've been a grad transfer. So that wasn't part of the equation then. And I don't know how that's going to look. Cause like for instance, I don't like what class is Davis and Igbinosun part of for Ohio State. Like, I don't know. Does he retroactively get applied to his own high school recruiting class? Does he get just tacked on to the end of the 2023 recruiting class? I'm not sure how that works, but they do need to be considered because it's all roster building, right? And now it's sort of all the same. I didn't include those guys in this exercise, but like clearly it would have raised the bar of the class for both of them. And Jonah Jackson like gets overlooked. He was really good for Ohio State that year and has become a very solid NFL player and was a 3rd-round pick, I believe. So there's the balance you have to strike there now between the high school recruiting and the recruiting of transfers, and Ohio State did, like, to give them credit, did a very good job of maybe filling holes that it couldn't quite fill during the high school recruiting by pulling the best players available at their respective positions from the portal that year.
All right,
it would have been good to pull some defensive players, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I think they probably figured that 2018 group was just going to like pick up where the 17 group left off, and it didn't happen.
Yeah. So this was fun, right? Really encouraging, optimistic way to start your week. But guess what? If we start it at the floor, it can only get better as the week goes on. So maybe it will. We'll see how that goes. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for starting your week here with us on the Podcast Daily. Have a great day. Have a great week. For Bill and Berm, I'm Austin. We'll talk to you later.